I want to talk about small keyboards and why there are two kinds of small keyboards. I often see people talking about small keyboards as if they're not as good as a large keyboard, that small keyboards are mostly about the looks, that they're less convenient, or people put emphasis on the keys that are missing from a small keyboard. Rather, I'd emphasize that with ergonomic keyboards, the focus is on bringing the functionality of a full keyboard to within easy reach of the hands, and it's only incidental that these keyboards are small. Just so everyone's on the same page, this is what a keyboard looks like. You've probably seen one before. This is a typical example of a small keyboard, and here's an example of an even smaller keyboard, which happens to lack the number row. And so as an example of what I mean by two different kinds of small keyboards, these two are both small, in fact the same size, but they're different kinds of keyboards. Or these two, they're both fashionably small, and that they both lack a number row, but they're both significantly different from one another. Just to back up a bit, one of the techniques small keyboards use are function keys or layers. Laptops commonly have keys just like this. So for example, in the picture here, you have function and F5 will play and pause media, or function and F11 and 12 will make the screen dimmer or brighter. The general name for this kind of thing is a layer, describing the keyboard behavior when some kind of function key is held. Another technique useful for small keyboards is tap-hold functionality, sometimes called dual function keys. So for example, when the key is tapped, it outputs one thing, or when it's held down, it behaves a different way. It's very useful for the modifier keys Shift, Control, Windows, and Alt. One useful technique is putting these modifier keys on the home row, so-called home row modifiers, so that the keys ASDF, or JK, L, and semicolon, behave like the Shift, Control, Windows, Alt modifiers when held, or just behave as normal when tapping these keys. To give an example of fitting the full keyboard functionality onto a smaller keyboard, here's an example key map. Here we can see the thumbs used for keys such as space, backspace, enter, and escape. The keyboards have access to the numbers and the symbols shifted from the numbers on the raise and the lower layers. Other symbols from the number row can also be accessed. Slash and backslash are put close together, and the braces and curly braces are on the same columns as the open and closed bracket. The navigation keys are also accessible. Perhaps it looks like a lot, but it's not actually all that much to remember. And so if we look at these fashionably small keyboards, keeping in mind that it's good to use the thumb more and it's bad to use the pinky finger more, we can see that the keyboard on the right is able to use more keys with the thumb for the distance between V and M. And we can see that the keyboard on top has to use the pinky finger more than the keyboard on the bottom for the letters to the right of the P. It's differences like that that lead me to say there are essentially two kinds of small keyboards. Ergonomic small keyboards, which offer more thumb keys and typically have an ortholinear or column stagger key layout, and traditional small keyboards, which typically have a big spacebar, retain the row stagger, and typically rely on using the pinky fingers to use many more keys. So considering small traditional keyboards, the advantages are they're very familiar, they're widely available, and they're ubiquitous, so you're going to have to know how to use one anyway. For example, most laptops have keyboards like this. But for the downsides, these keyboards retain all the disadvantages and bad design features of the traditional keyboard. Whereas considering ergonomic keyboards, these do make the keyboard much more comfortable, but they can be difficult to find off the shelf. Either they're very expensive or they're very difficult to build. Often the key map is more complicated and they'll likely take some time to get used to. It can also be difficult to find keycaps for these keyboards. To help illustrate the difference, I thought it'd be useful to look at the placement of function keys on small keyboards. Here we can see the function key is in the corner. Here the function keys are actually not bad. They can almost be pushed by the thumbs. This one, the function key, is in the corner. Here the function key also in the corner. And here the function key also in the corner. Whereas on ergonomic keyboards in this example, we can see that the function keys are very much intended to be used with the thumbs. The use of layering to make keys more accessible to the hands does come with the benefit of reducing hand movement, but also has the cost of an additional complexity. This isn't a strict increase in complexity, because any key that can't be immediately hit with your hands from home row either requires you to hit some kind of function key, or it requires your hand to move to hit the key. That said, as a rule of thumb, I'd say that below 32 to 34 keys on the keyboard, it becomes increasingly impractical to use the keyboard. Another thing to keep in mind about small keyboards is how the keyboard is used. With both hands on the keyboard, such as when typing out text or when using a keyboard-driven program like Vim or Emacs, the smaller keyboard size is less of a disadvantage because your hand can more easily hit the function key to use the layers. Whereas with mouse and keyboard usage, such as when playing first-person shooter games or when doing anything spatial like using Paint or Blender or some CAD program, the hands are more likely to move about, and so it's very useful to have a number row when using a keyboard like this. And the keyback layers need more thought so that the keyboard can be used without having to bring both hands to the keyboard. And aside from the two categories of small keyboards that are traditional small keyboards or ergonomic small keyboards, arguably there's a bucket of keyboards that are just incoherently designed and don't really fit into either. With these keyboards, they often are the worst of both worlds. They pay both costs of a trade-off to very little benefit. For example, having a big spacebar on a small ortholinear keyboard seems quite bad, because a big spacebar may be excusable on a traditional design, but an ortholinear keyboard may take time to get used to. So you're paying the cost of not being familiar, but while also retaining the bad design decisions of a traditional layout. Another example I've seen are keyboards that remove the number row, but then add on dedicated keys for a number pad. Removing the number row goes with the logic of preferring to use layers over moving the hands, but using the numpad goes with the logic of preferring to use the hands over using layers. So the result is a keyboard that's not so small, but is also not so simple to use. And in terms of split keyboards, splitting the keyboard up is a big ergonomic improvement for many people, but the idea of using your thumbs more and using your pinky less is going to be desirable regardless of if the keyboard is split or not. Here, the keyboard on the left is split, but clearly a traditional layout, and the keyboard on the right is clearly an ortholinear or ergonomic layout. Some keyboards, like the BM40 here, have a two-use spacebar in the middle, following the rationale of it's good to use the thumb more and the pinky finger less. One technique is to split the letters apart so that you're not having an extra outer column for the pinky fingers, and then the thumbs get to use 2 or 3 keys each, like in the picture on the right. While on the topic of small keyboards and ergonomic keyboards, let's consider Alice layout keyboards. There are a variety of keyboards that have layouts like this. They're often touted as more ergonomic than a traditional keyboard. Two things in favor of the ergonomics are the letters being slightly split apart and slightly at an angle, which I imagine is more ergonomic. But aside from this, the keyboard does not offer very many thumb keys. The keyboard is not symmetrical. Indeed, you can see the 6 is on the left-hand side, whereas the letter Y is on the right-hand side. A keyboard not being symmetrical means it's unlikely that the left-hand side and the right-hand side are equally ergonomic. And I find that the keyboard retaining a row stagger also discounts it from being ergonomic. Some Alice keyboard layouts are also guilty of removing more keys and adding some more keys back, which also seems a bit incoherent to me. My blanket recommendation for a keyboard, with all this in mind, would be a 5-row, 15-column ortholinear keyboard. These have a favorable balance of advantages, where these fit within the GH60 cases, where it's easy to find different varieties of these cases. It's easy to find good PCBs for 5x15 ortholinears. These keyboards are convenient for all use cases, be it playing first-person shooter games or typing stuff out. And these keyboards are small enough to travel with. They're small, but they're not too small. And there are different ways you can arrange your key map. So here's an example of small enough to travel with, where it'll fit on a laptop keyboard. But yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to say about small keyboards and how there are two different kinds. There's the ergonomic kind, which bring the full functionality of the keyboard to within easy reach of the hands, and they make more use of the thumbs and less use of the pinky fingers. And then there are keyboards that are small like a laptop keyboard that retain the familiar and faulty elements of traditional keyboards. Thanks for watching.